Okay, good day, grade 12s. I'm going to start the series of videos on chapter 10. The topic there is regional development. You will see the first subtopic is industrial development in South Africa. This is your exam guideline. Remember, when you study, you are always keeping your exam guideline next to you so you can see how much in depth you need to study each topic. Now, for industrial development, you'll see the first reason. The first lesson, we're going to focus on the concept of industrial development as well as the reasons for industrial development. Then in the second lesson, I'm going to talk about South Africa's industrial development policies, the NIPF and the IPAP. And then in the last lesson, we're going to focus on the industrial development strategies, which is the NRDS and the IMS. You will see there's no essay question here. All right, it says briefly describe the concept, briefly explain the reasons, and for the NIPF and the IPAP, an overview and the focus areas of the INPF and the IPAP. That is what is important. Same as for the NRDS and the IMS, again, an overview of what it is, what the focus is of those different strategies. Right, so if we go then to your textbook, you are on page 138. Okay, so first of all, what is industrial development? Okay, now first of all, we're going to look at the difference between the industrial development policy and an industrial development strategy. Okay, an industrial development policy is any government regulation or a law that is made by government that is aimed at developing measures to enhance the industrial operations and encourage investment into the industry. All right, so when the government makes a regulation, when they pass a law relating to industrial development, then it will be an industrial development policy. All right, an industrial development strategy refers to the strategic plans or the methods that will be implemented in order to reach the industry policy goals. So basically, your industrial development policy is the government regulation where they pass a law to make clear their intentions of industrial development, and the strategy, they're going to literally come up with different plans. Now, how are they going to achieve the objectives of the industrial development policy? The policy is there to set objectives and to set direction to their actions, and the strategies are the plans or the methods. Now, how are they going to reach their objectives? Now, when we talk about the industrial sector of the economy, that includes all those economic activities that creates a finished, usable product, and then the production and construction sectors. So the industrial sector basically refers to the manufacturing sector, okay, which happens in factories mainly, as well as construction. Okay, anything that is involved in production, where finished goods are produced, would be forming part of our industrial sector. Okay, now when we look at the history of industrial development in the country, obviously when the democratic government, the ANC, took over the ruling of the country in 1994, it inherited a divided economy that obviously had very high levels of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. We looked at this also in chapter 9. All right, the government used various different strategies to try and create more equality, to create more employment. Now, we looked at the RDP, GEAR, ASGISA, NGP, NDP. All of those strategies that we looked at in chapter 9 was used to try and address these issues. Okay, and the industrial development policy that the government inherited was focused mainly on inward policies. Okay, for example, we did this in chapter 5. In 1994, the focus was more on import substitution rather than export promotion of exports. Okay, the reason for that was because of the sanctions and boycotts against South Africa pre-1994, countries showing their opposition against apartheid in South Africa. Obviously, when the ANC took over in 1994, the policy that was used, the industrial development policy that was used at the time, was import substitution. Inward focusing, meaning that import substitution, the goal is to rather start producing things ourselves rather than importing it. Now, we couldn't at that stage import anything because of boycotts and sanctions. Remember, we spoke about forced import substitution and voluntary import substitution. All right. A lot of it was forced. We were forced to try and establish our own industries to produce certain things because other countries would not sell it to us. We were not able to import it. Right, but then when the ANC took over, they changed to a more outward focusing strategy, okay, based on export promotion. But obviously they kept certain protective measures, obviously to protect our local industries. Now we looked in chapter 5 at the reasons why we sometimes use protective strategies like import taxes, like import quotas. We need to protect our vulnerable industries, our infant industries, to give them chance to develop. All right, so we use basically now a combination of import substitution and export promotion. Remember in chapter 5, we did discuss that if we look at other countries in the world, the emerging economies that are having high economic growth rates, they benefit from international trade because they focus more on export promotion. We said export promotion is a positive strategy because we are encouraging exports, rather than the negative strategy of import substitution where we try to discourage imports. All right, but basically nowadays we use a combination of both. Obviously we do use import substitution and protective measures to protect our vulnerable industries, our strategic industries, new and upcoming industries, and we also focus on export promotion to encourage our industries to produce more, to increase the variety and the quantity of things that we can export to other countries, because that does bring injections into the country in the form of the money that we receive for the goods that we export. Okay, now if we look at the contribution to the GDP, if we look at the structural changes that has happened since 1994, we can see that since 1994, our economic growth has been driven mainly by the secondary and the tertiary sector. Okay, we did mention last year that the primary sector's contribution is very small. Their relative contribution is very small. It is less than 10%. All right. You'll see that the output, the contribution of the secondary sector gradually did decline and then stabilize. So up to a point it did increase, but at some point the contribution that the secondary sector had made to the GDP started declining. That is called deindustrialization. I suggest that you write that down and just take note of what that means. All right, deindustrialization is when the contribution of your secondary sector to the GDP is decreasing. Okay, in other words, there's negative growth in our industrial sector. All right, but if we look in terms of the secondary sector, remember the secondary sector has got three components. The first one is manufacturing, the second one is electricity, gas, and water, and the third one is construction. All right, so if we look at industrial development, remember our main focus would be on manufacturing as well as construction. And if we look at the contribution made by manufacturing as part of the secondary sector, that in itself, one of the three components of the secondary sector contributes over 18.5% of the GDP. All right, that's big. One industry out of many different ones, primary, secondary, and tertiary sector industries, manufacturing on its own is contributing 18.5% of the GDP. More than half of all exports, okay, so more than 50% of our exports is recorded as manufacturing. And then it is the second largest employer in the country. So it is very important in terms of job creation. Okay, manufacturing accounts for the largest share of the GDP amongst your production-driven sector. In other words, in the secondary sector, manufacturing makes a far bigger contribution if we compare it to electricity, gas, and water, and construction. The production-driven sector is the secondary sector. Okay, domestic and foreign demand for new motor vehicles continues to boost the manufacturing of motor vehicles, parts, and accessories. And since 1994, our automotive sector has more than doubled in size. You will see when we look at the different policies and the strategies in terms of industrial development, the car manufacturing industry was a focus area of many of those plans. The government deliberately invested millions of rands into establishing this automotive industry and creating growth in this industry. So it's one of the success stories of our industrial development strategies. All right, now both domestic and foreign demand obviously has increased. We manufacture both finished motor vehicles, finished vehicles. We also manufacture our own parts, engines, accessories. which a lot of it also then we export to the rest of Africa. In 2011, the manufacturing growth was led by strong growth in the production of metal products, okay, things like machinery. All right, obviously we have ISCOR in our country that produces iron ore, that mines for iron ore and produces all kinds of steel products. So there was a growth in the production of the metal industry, metals and machinery industry. Also wood products, paper and pulp, cement manufacturing, publishing and printing, and then food, beverages and tobacco. Okay, all of this is part of the manufacturing sector. So the growth in the contribution of the manufacturing sector to the GDP, the reason for that growth can be found in the increase in the production of metals and machinery, the wood, the paper and the pulp, the cement, etc., etc. All right, because of growth in these sub-industries that created the growth in the manufacturing sector. All right, then it also does make a contribution to employment. Okay, recently now, employment has been the highest in wholesale, retail and trade. That would be tertiary sector, okay, not secondary sector. So obviously, the long-term increases in employment in all sectors needs to be underpinned by high growth in the production sectors, obviously of which manufacturing is a part. All right, so obviously, wholesale and retail, the tertiary sector, they are responsible for distribution. But if there's not growth in manufacturing, manufacturing is where goods are produced. If we are not increasing our production, we will not have an increase in wholesale, retail and trade either. All right, we need to produce things first before we can distribute them. All right, so yes, we need obviously to stimulate employment in manufacturing. All right, then in terms of the contribution to the exports, I've already said that the industrial sector makes a substantial contribution to the country's exports. Manufacturing in its own basically contributes to over 50% of any exports that we record in our balance of payments. Okay, now these three headings here, these are the reasons for industrial development. Okay, I just want to take you back to the guideline. You'll see this says briefly explain the reasons for industrial development. Okay, so basically why do we want to create more industrial development? Because of its contribution to the GDP. Okay, we need to stop this deindustrialization that is happening. Okay, we need to stimulate our secondary sector, stimulate manufacturing so that our secondary sector can grow, so that we can stop this deindustrialization that is happening. Remember, if we want to become an industrialized country, the contribution of our secondary sector needs to increase. All right, it is not nearly high enough at this stage. The total of the secondary sector's contribution to the GDP is between 22 and 25% of the GDP. Okay, that is low compared to other industrialized countries. In South Africa, the tertiary sector is the biggest contributor, the service industries. All right, so we need to create industrial development so that we can increase the contribution to the GDP. Okay, so that we can stop the deindustrialization. Second reason is so that we can create sustainable employment, because we said we had to produce things first before the tertiary sector has anything to sell. Okay, so we need to stimulate employment as well, seeing as though we do have a high level of unemployment. And then the last reason for industrial development is the fact that we want to increase the contribution that it makes to our exports. At the moment, I think in the top 5 export products, 3 or 4 out of that 5 is actually coming from the primary sector. They're mining metals, gold, coal, diamonds, that kind of stuff is what we are exporting. Those things are not renewable. So once we've mined all the gold and the gold gets finished, we're going to have something else that we can export instead. And with manufacturing, obviously we control how many things we produce. It's more under our control. With the minerals, what's there is there and we can mine. We can't make more of them. So we need to stop our reliance on the primary sector in terms of our exports. So we need to create an industrial sector. We need to develop our industrial sector so that we can increase the production of finished goods and services, so that also we can create exports of those finished goods. We don't have to rely on the primary sector for our export products. Okay, we need to have a plan B when the gold and the coal and the diamonds and the stuff gets finished. Manufacturing sector producing things that we can export, that is a brilliant plan B. All right, that's the end of this lesson. I will continue in the next lesson with your industrial development policies.